Hi everyone, and welcome to Linköping University and to Tema Technology and Social Change. Both to the big group here, but also to the ones joining online, of course. My name is Karin Edberg, and we are here today for one of the lectures in the lecture series Planning in Transition, which is this year devoted to mobility and sustainable mobility in general. We have had a number of distinguished guests this far, and will continue today as well. All the previous lectures are available online. I can tell you if you would like to see them afterwards now. But for today, we will welcome Malene here. And this will actually be the last lecture for 2024. But we will be back with a new interesting program next year on a slightly different topic. So keep posted on that one. But then for today, I would like to welcome Malene Freudendal Pedersen, which is professor on urban planning at Aalborg University in Denmark. And in focus of Malene's research is different aspects of mobility and everyday life, including aspects of freedom, unfreedom, and utopias, I believe. And lately including work on, for instance, the 15-minute city, publishing several influential articles and being also an active voice in the surrounding community. In this talk, Malene will focus on different aspects of planning for sustainable transitions and the important role of everyday mobility practices. So Malene will talk for about maximum 1 hour. And then we will have time for some questions and also conversations, of course. You that are joining us online are welcome to post your questions in the chat, and we will read them up aloud. And after this lecture, we will also continue this discussion in a World Cafe format with some refreshments in this neighboring room over here. But unfortunately, only for us that are here in place. So, but without further ado, I will leave the word to you, Malene.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation and for the very nice treatment I got while I was here. I was fed and taken care of very, very well. I'm Malene Freudendal Pedersen, and I am professor in urban planning at Aalborg University, which has a campus in Copenhagen. So this is where I'm placed. Just saying that in case you wonder on some of my empirical stuff, because a lot of that is basically from Copenhagen, because this is where I am. My research is basically just to give this explaining slide, I am a professor in urban planning. I actually started out as more in transportation research. From the beginning, there was actually once a professor who said to me that I was very lucky because I've been doing the same kind of research for all of my career. And that's true. For some odd reason, I quite early got into being interested in transport, I called it at that time. Then there was a mobilities paradigm that emerged, and I moved into that because I had this focus on everyday life that I thought was really important. Basically started from an outset that we don't take it seriously enough. Everyday life is often looked at as something in a small glass bubble we look at and think about how people do, and where my focus is much more on how everyday life policy and planning are actually interconnected and producing and reproducing each other in certain ways. So this just to show you that it's the technology, it's the planning, it's the environment, it's the communities. These are things that I'm basically trying to figure out with everyday life as its core. It doesn't mean that I don't do research on policy and planning, because I do, but I'm always having an outset in everyday life. The two pictures is just to show you two different pictures of Copenhagen, that I'm not the one looking at the overall planning strategy. I'm much more on street level. This is where I find my interest in trying to investigate some of these things. And this is just to give you one of the famous quotes from John Urry's book Mobilities that came in 2007. There's too much transport in the study of travel and not enough society and thinking through the complex intersecting relations between society and transport. So this is very much where my key interest lies, in understanding that relationship and basically how to change it. Sometimes I forget to say that my aim is change. I'm a researcher who is researching on how to change towards more sustainability. And the reason why I'm saying that I sometimes forget to say it is because it's so much part of my way of doing research that I just take it for granted. But this is basically good for you to know that this is the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing. I am not one of those researchers who just do research to understand and then think change lies somewhere else. I'm one of those who thinks I'm doing research to understand, and then I'm also the one who's responsible to think about, not make the change happen, but think about which threads can we actually pull to think about how to make change happen. Basically, and I'm going to do this short, but there is no doubt, also based on all the research that I did, that we have a serious problem with the way we are doing planning today. And this is where I forgot the last part of the story I started with. I'm now a professor in urban planning. And the reason why, I don't know if that's the reason why, but I'm happy about being that, because I realized that within transportation research, we're not going to change anything. We're not going to get anywhere closer to the sustainable mobility systems, because it's the rational way of thinking doesn't allow for understanding all these complex intersections that mobilities has with society. So that's why I moved into planning, even if I still do mobilities, because this is my way of thinking. This is where we have access to some kind of change. And one of the things that is obviously clear is this, that modern planning paradigms are still technocratic with an ideal of flow and zero friction. It's about getting as fast as possible around. We have a dominating neoliberal concept of an economy based on global flows of trade and workforces that results in an unchallenged principle of seamless mobility as the pathway for efficient organizations of societies. And just to give an example of that, there was a news article in Denmark, in the Danish radio the other day, that was basically, so we have one news article that is about the problems with all these floodings and the climate change and what happens. The next news article is about how problematic it is that Germans' economy is not growing this year, but again, is shrinking 0.2%, and how problematic that is for also the Danish society. And I'm thinking, okay, where is the link between the fact that we can't keep consuming the way we do and handle climate change? So this way of these things not talking together at all, because it's totally different agendas. And this is one of the things that goes for transport as well. We talk about sustainability, but we still keep planning transport to be something that's efficient and fast and seamless. And that means cars. This is how it works. And what we often seem to be missing is this question, why and for what? Who are we actually planning for? Why are we planning for these people? Because when we talk about car transport, for instance, as the main driver for a lot of things, what about the 34% of families in Denmark, for instance, that don't own a car? So we are there. It's a rational planning paradigm that is so closed around its own rationalities and keeps reproducing things in the same way, which means planning for the cars. And John Urry and Dennis Kingsley wrote this book in 2009 called After the Car, where they talk about this auto logic, that is the internal growth logic of planning systems and policies that primarily focus on the accessibility and efficiency of the private car. The private car in everything comes in the top of the hierarchy. And Nigel Fish said in 2004 that 100 years or so after the birth of automobility, the experience of driving is sinking into our technological unconsciousness and producing a phenomenology that we increasingly take for granted. And this phenomenology and this way of thinking is extremely prevalent, especially in transport planning and policies, but actually in many other places where the whole thing, just even having a critical question towards the way we plan for the car is actually really problematic. I'm not going to say more about cars. I could talk about cars for an hour, but I'm just setting the scene to say we have an issue here. And as long as it's an issue we're actually not able to discuss, because we're not. We're trying, and sometimes it works a little bit, but most of the time it's not up for discussion how we actually, the role of the car, why it's important. I recently saw another news story. We're talking about sustainable mobility in Denmark, we get more cars, people drive more in them, like most everywhere else. Then there was this talk about what is sustainable mobility, and then they come out with this where they ask some researchers who are the researchers who do most of the work for these transport models that we do to basically support this way of thinking. And the argument is that buses and trains, or mostly buses, but also some trains, are not as sustainable as the car because there's not a lot of people using the buses. So that means, of course, when you drive alone in a big bus or you drive alone in the car, then the car is more sustainable. But if you put some limitations on the car driving and got more people into the buses, it's far more sustainable, but that's not part of the discussion. So it's basically a rationality that's part of simplifying issues in a way that they have models built up that can actually simplify that issue so it becomes a question that is kept in a closed silo. And this is one of the big problems we have with transportation. But of course, that also puts something on the role of the planner, and some of I'm applying for projects right now. So this is basically new things that I'm trying to work on. But it's basically figuring out what is the type of knowledge production that actually happens. And the expertise and the knowledge production develops and reproduces these myopic rationalities and these trained incapacities that systematically ignore specific phenomena and concerns. And why do they do that? Well, it makes a lot of sense because a key function of professional expertise is to simplify and standardize to render complex realities governable and amenable to intervention. So the argument would be understanding how sustainable mobilities work is way too complicated because it's not just about screwing on one button here and screwing on another button here, and then we solve the problem. It is actually a complex problem to solve, which I'm going to talk more about at the rest of this lecture. But I think one of my key points, and probably because I'm old and cranky or been working in this field way too long, is basically to start to figure out why is it that we have all these ideas and there's been so much research on it, but we're still stuck in the same place. Nothing really happens. And if anything, it goes into the wrong direction. And it's also this point because these initial design choices, they have a decisive impact and channel sustained attention to particular problems while rendering other potential observations out of focus. We build an infrastructure system that is basically focused on the car. So to redo that, it actually needs rethinking the way we plan our cities, the way we plan our neighborhoods, the way we plan connections. And this is extremely difficult because now we had this in place and we had it in place for the last 100 years. So it's quite a challenge to change it. Almost made it. Okay. And this also means that when we have this system, the way we then think about sustainable transport is that because it's nothing new, current patterns of transport with their dominant patterns of energy use are not sustainable, and unpresent trends may compound the environment problems the world is facing. 1997, there is nothing new in this issue. I really need to cough. Sorry. And this means that with this rational transport planning paradigm, the way we try to handle it is basically, for instance, this very much used SUMP or sustainable mobility plans And the whole idea is it's a multi-criteria analysis that must focus on 4 major areas: new technologies, demand management, land use development, and soft measures. What most countries do in Europe is they choose the new technologies. In Denmark, the plan to make sustainable mobilities is e-cars. They're not even trying to put anything else in there, but it's e-cars. I'm really sorry. Once you can't cough, you stop coughing, right? And the problem with that is that that the e-cars becomes the technology that's going to save all this. Then there is this demand management, the idea that if you increase prices, that you get people to change their behavior. I would say there is plenty of research out there that shows that if you want to use prices to change people's way of doing things, it's not raising the gasoline price from 10 crowns to 12 crowns, but it's raising it from 10 crowns to 40 crowns, because before that, nothing really happens. And then there is, of course, the integrated planning, which is really important. And then there is the last thing, which I seriously hate, and I use every opportunity to say that out loud, because this is also part of the huge problem there is within transportation, is that we have something we call soft measures. Because we have the hard measures and we have the soft measures. We want the hard ones because they're the proofs. The soft is this fluffy thing. The soft is, oddly enough, also where culture, for instance, is. And culture is one of the most hardcore things to change. So soft measures has become a way it's gendered, without a doubt. Also in relations to who actually do which kind of research and which kind of work there. But it's also a world that we need to stop using, because it undermines all the things that are not about numbers and figures. And if we take mobility seriously, if we take seriously to make a change, we cannot have a system where everything that is about the things that matter to people or the culture people are part of, where that doesn't play a role. Because when we do that, then this is what sustainable mobility is. And I guess you all know, but I'm just going to repeat it. E-cars doesn't work as a way of handling sustainable mobility, because for the first, one thing is the space. That doesn't change anything if we want to reuse the space for something else. Asphalt is not the best thing in the world for rainwater mitigation. And the thing is that people now get the third car instead of the second car. So, and the more we raise young people to be the backseat passengers of car, and if they only drive by car as kids, they are very unflexible in using different modes when they grow up. So that's a bad idea. Then there is the thing about the energy. So if we want to make a sustainable society where we need to have a lot of different things that is being on sustainable energy, like energy, wind, water, then we can't also have all the cars we have now, because then we can't produce enough sustainable energy. And then there's all the things with the particles. We're not even talking about production here, so we leave that out of it. But all the things with the particles that are one of the biggest killers we have in the world is air pollution and the micro and nanoparticles from tires against asphalt and from braking systems. That's one of the most dangerous things. And e-cars are much heavier than gasoline cars, so that means that's actually more of these particles they make. So just to say that all the research there is around e-cars shows that it's not a viable solution. Yeah, we can have e-cars in the future, and we should have e-cars in the future, but we cannot have e-cars that replace all the normal cars we have now, or gasoline cars. And then the other one that actually died, luckily, a little bit, this whole idea about automated driving, because that's also extremely sustainable, because the cars can drive closer to each other, lots of stories. What has been shown so far is that automated driving is going to work in public transport systems who are in their own Skinner, like in their own tracé. I don't know what that word is in English. But as soon as we get into city areas where people are living, automation doesn't work because it's not possible to create these systems that can handle all the unexpected things that happen. So in order for automation to work, you need to have cleaned spaces. And nobody actually really want to live in these clean spaces. That's not why we are spending all that money and energy all around the world to make livable cities, livable neighborhoods, and all that stuff. So basically, today, transportation planning is a complex system of epistemological black boxes constructed in a collaboration between academia and planning practices. And it reproduces established professional infrastructures for knowing. How do we learn things? What do we know about stuff? If we have the same way of always looking into what we know, but also what is important to know, no new elements come in. And then there is the thing that planning often favors the upper middle class white male body. Now we're moving in more and more into the gender part that's coming a little bit of. This is Mimi Scheller who wrote this in her book, Mobility Justice from 2018. And he's not the first one who pointed to that. I remember Denver Nixon in 2012, I think, wrote an article where he said that it's not strange that the transport system looks like it does because it's white men in gray suits who actually makes the decisions about how our transportation system should look. And then there was Katharina Manderschall that said that the social technical script of transportation is excluding mobility futures different from the current system. Because it is absolutely interesting that something that you could say has so much impact on so many other sectors of everything, not just everyday life, but also planning business life, it actually gets allowed to exist in its own small silo without having to. Transportation should be not a vertical domain, but a horizontal domain. And it's been discussed for so many years, but it still doesn't happen. And because the problem is, if it becomes horizontal, it can't stay in the same track it did for so many years. So basically, one of the reasons it has been discussed is that maybe it's also because of the gender inequalities in the transportation system. It's gender inequality in terms of who is planned for that persists when we look at who is doing the planning. Gender norms are shown to shape the way we respond, think, and act in relations to a specific topic. And the workforce in the transportation sector consists of 80% male employees and even fewer women at the top decision level. That means the higher up you get, and the whole transportation sector is also those cleaning the trains. So the higher up you get in the decision level, the fewer women are actually there. Sweden is one of these countries who are actually doing better than many others, probably not a surprise to you. But it's still, it's still not equal at all. And I guess a lot of you heard about this Caroline Perez's book, Invisible Women, exposing data bias in a world designed for men. And what she's also saying is if you haven't read it, it's actually a quite interesting book. It's a popular scientific book, but it has a lot of numbers and a lot of examples of how this actually works. But what she also says is it's not an outcome of a generally malicious practice, but it's a product of millennia's way of thinking that she frames as a kind of not thinking. And this is basically in line with the same things when I'm talking about myopic realities or trained incapacities. It's simply a way of excluding specific elements from this whole academic practice and planning world, policy world as well, which means that that is probably also why I find it interesting, because I've been in this field for so many years now, and it's really, really difficult not to sound very grumpy and old when people come up with a project and you think we already did that. Come on, are we going to do that one more time? Because of course, I don't say that because I know I'm not allowed to, but it makes me frustrated that we have like these big funding agency. I was recently invited into a project some years ago, some good colleagues, clever colleagues, made in a funding agency in Denmark, and they got the money, and I was invited into it, and I was like, okay, I could tell you what's coming out of this project because this project is made exactly like this a couple of times before. The problem is just the knowledge that comes out isn't used. So now we're doing it again, and then sometimes some of the planners and the politicians also say we need knowledge about everyday practice, and I'm like, no, we don't. We need more. We can always have more. We could also just start by using some of it that's around. And I think for me, that's basically the primary reason why I started to say, okay, we need to look more at how are these systems reproducing themselves in certain ways that it's not possible to get any of this knowledge into the system and circulate. And this is just to show you this fact that there is a huge difference between how men and women use transport in everyday life. What we have in Denmark is we have a big transport habit investigation. It's made every year, and you can pay for it and get they can run certain things, but they also put out these reports every year, or a couple of them every year. The last time they put out one on gender differences was in 2013. So since that, gender has not been mentioned at all in these things that are coming out publicly. I know this year Copenhagen, and that's probably also because I've been talking to a lot of people from Copenhagen many times because I work a lot with them, but they asked for the gender numbers for when they did the mobility report for Copenhagen. But it's just something that is not even addressed. Even if the numbers are there, we don't get the information. And now I'm just going to show you a short movie that I actually found really cool. It's because I was invited to KTH some years ago to give a keynote on gender and mobilities. And that was, of course, really nice. But I also thought it's really sad because I didn't do more research on gender. Like, I didn't do research projects on gender. Gender is, of course, always part of it, but I never did it. But I'm the best one they can find in Denmark. That's me. And I actually thought that was a little bit of a sad situation, but I just wanted to show you the commercial that they did for the conference, which I found really cool.
The use of artificial intelligence to fill human independence is driving our mobility choices. It is increasingly important that we make sure our technologies are inclusive and relevant for all its users. When we develop new technology, we cannot take ourselves and who we are out of the design process. We often test our prototypes on our own teams, with women making up only 22% of transport orders in Europe. What does this mean for our engineering products? Will we then end up with cars that are safer for men? We already have. Will we develop virtual reality tools that make women feel dizzy? We already have. Will we develop voice recognition tools that don't work well for women? Can you repeat the question? Will we end up with a transportation infrastructure system that is totally optimized for half of the population? Let's hope not. This is what the coming conference is about.
And I think this, the reason, of course, why I really liked it was because, it's basically the thing. There's so many things we know. There's so many things we know about this area that is so unequal and it's so gendered, but it continues in that. Nothing happens. It's not true that nothing happens. I would say the public tone changed a little bit, and I say especially municipalities, especially in Denmark, they're really trying, but we still have an overall system that doesn't really allow for that change to happen. And you could say my whole point in a lot of the things that I'm doing is basically to say we need to find a way to move the policy and planning closer to the middle of these two circles. I know this is a very simplistic figure, but we cannot only talk about transportation and movement as something that is something we can model. There is so much society, culture, and practice in it. And then I'm just coming up with this hard and soft measures again, because you have to stop using those terms. That's very, very clear message from here. Don't use it. And it's totally stupid because it's gendered and makes it unequal. And basically, it's just putting words on what it is that we want, like different kind of knowledge, which kind of tools we're using, because it's easy to replace with words. So the question is, why did we come up with this soft and hard division because we don't need it for anything, because we can just put words on what it is. Are we talking about culture? Are we talking about models? Are we talking about interviews? Are we talking about calculations? What are we talking about? Just use the words and get out of this gendered way of talking about it. And that's it on gender. I'm not going to talk more about that. Now I'm going to move into something about everyday life instead. And I put the same slide on, and that's basically just to top that with this, that the interconnection between everyday practices and policy and planning is essential in battling climate change. I think that we have a huge problem with talking about getting people to change behavior as that which would change the way the direction is. We cannot never leave that up to put the responsibility on the individual. But of course the everyday practice is important. So it has to be in an interaction between everyday life policy and planning. And just to make sure what I talk about when I talk about everyday life practices is that sometimes I say behavior. I don't do research on behavior. In Danish, it's called adfærd. I think it's pretty much the same word in Sweden, right? Adfærd. Behavior. What do you call that in Swedish? Beteende, yeah. Because there's a difference between that and practice. Elizabeth Shaw, who is actually a practice researcher, wrote this about how the way we understand behavior. For the most part, social change is thought to depend upon values and attitudes, the A, which are believed to drive the kind of behavior, the B, that individuals choose, the C, to adopt. She calls it the ABC model. That means you explain something to people, you make campaigns, they understand what they're doing is not very sustainable, and they change the way they're doing it. Basically, that is very much about a cognitive idea about how you get people to do things differently, whereas the practice research is providing an alternative means of understanding the complex dynamics between the elements that constitutes the practice, allowing it to be considered as a social issue rather than focusing on individual behavior. So practice theory, you're interested in the practices. The practice happens between the materialities that are in urban planning and the materialities you have access to. It happens in the competences you actually have, because if you haven't learned to bike or you're not used to using public transport, you're actually not really competent on doing that, and also in the making of meaning. And when they say it's a social issue, it's because they don't focus on what the individual does, but they focus on the practice as something that is constructed to, like, the sociality we are part of. So you could say it's a set of doings and sayings organized by a pool of understandings. So that's the way practice theory is thinking about this. I did this work on structural stories early on. I'm not a practice theorist, but I am aligned with some of the thoughts. I realized afterwards, because I didn't know that when I did this. But basically for me, that what I found really important was a focus on how the sayings are informing the doings, the way we talk about things. How does this actually impact how we do things in everyday life? And the structural comes from Giddens' theory of structuration and has an outset in central dynamics of the mobile risk society, reflexivity, individualization, cosmopolitanism, ambivalences. I could say a lot about that, but I'm not, because then I'm going to talk too long. It's basically a micro discourse. It's a way of understanding how hegemony is created, the things that we take for granted, and the way we normalize things. This is how we do things. When you have kids, you need a car. The train is always late. Ways we talk about things that normalizes them into a certain way of seeing things. And changing practices is also about changing stories that guides the everyday practices of individuals in relations, by questioning or reconceptualizing the normality or taking for granted naturalness of specific actions. Because in order to get everyday life to work, we actually need a lot of things that are routines. As I always say, if we had to get up every morning and rethink the sequence of which we put our clothes on, take a shower and get ready, drink our morning coffee, read the newspapers, eat breakfast, we would go crazy. It goes on exactly the same way every morning, especially also when we have kids, or I still have kids. They're not just that small that I need to get them up in the morning anymore. But then things goes on like that. And so does a lot of the organization of the rest of the day. So does a lot of like everyday mobility practices. They are also part of a routine that we just do. What we think about is our boss that is annoying, or our partner that we just had a nice time with, or we want to have a fight with, or our old mom that we need to take care of. We don't think about how we do these things. It just happens. So when we think that we can explain to people they should stop using their car, for instance, what we are in reality asking them is that they should redo their everyday life organization and then start being reflexive on how they do that. And of course, people are not interested. This is also why price doesn't have a big impact, because nobody want to redo the everyday life organization. And this is actually a little bit of a depressing news I have on that, because it's from a project that is still running for another year. It's called Food, Mobility and Housing in the Sustainable Transition of Everyday Life. It's funded by the Independent Research Fund in Denmark. It's a project that is basically, we are 3 professors, a car professor, a food professor, and a house professor, that basically said, okay, now we take all the knowledge we have and put it together and see if we can move on from here. So we still have a year left where we are working with the provision side before we work with the consumption side. We have young adults as the empirical group. There's 2 PhDs that just came out of this project. So they specifically got young climate conscious people to be the empirical group. And the depressing part of this project is they needed to be engaged in climate. And they all came up with these stories, like in relation structural stories in relation to houses. Kids need to have their own room. Kids need milk and meat to grow up healthy. And when one have kids, one need a car, or one need a car for leisure travel. So these structural stories are there. So even if they were extremely climate conscious, what we saw was, because we also interviewed them in the moving phase, like when they wanted to change their home, a lot of them ended up moving out of the city because they needed a bigger house and they needed to be able to pay for that. So what happened was that these very climate conscious young people, biking, fermenting their own candy, only eating vegan, having not small places, but not humongous places, they actually ended up living, the majority of them, in bigger houses, having a car that they use for everything, and just also in getting more meat and milk into their household. So it's a little bit of a depressing result, I know, but it's also really interesting to see that how much these ways of having expectations, or what is taken for granted, what is natural, actually also ends up dominating these kinds of lives. My favorite story was this guy called Jasper, who talked about when we visited him the second time. They had 4 or 5 bikes in Copenhagen. They had a really nice apartment they were really happy about, and they were also doing all sorts of that stuff. He told about his new place. They lived 30 kilometers out of Copenhagen. They were having a Christmas lunch. They needed flour. He grabbed, because they forgot to buy it, he grabbed the key to the car, and then his girlfriend looked at him and said, "Why are you taking the car?" And he was like, "It's true. It was totally stupid. The supermarket is less than a kilometer away. I could just have taken the bike. It was one thing I needed to pick up, but the car is the default solution when you live in the suburbs." And I think we actually got a lot of these quite interesting things, like about what is default solutions and how things work. Another reason why I also start to think about the importance of planning, because what kind of planning for what kind of people are we actually doing? So if we are building places where the car is the center of transportation, or in top of the hierarchy, this is also how people are that's what they're gonna use. They're not going to change it even if they're climate conscious, even if they would like to, because this is the kind of the way everyday life get normalized and works. And here, of course, storytelling, because you could also say structural stories, is also a subpart of the whole idea of storytelling. The argumentative turn in policy and planning, investigating shifts in society's discursive patterns and structures, and this idea that stories have fundamental persuasive character when it comes to making decisions on future cities. The way we talk about what is important, is also part of storytelling. Is not just about telling what's going on, it's also a way of shaping the future. And the articulation and storytelling enhances what Martin Heyer calls ontological expansion, which is the transformative capacity of planners to create things that doesn't exist. So the way we tell stories about futures, the way we think about how we would like things to look, is also part of making it possible to create it. And just to give short examples on how it looks in politics, for instance, this is a former transport minister we had. He was the one that made it cheaper to buy bigger cars. We become freer and richer with the car. It's a barrier for growth, no doubt about that. I don't think we can find one economist that disagree with the fact that if we take away the toll on the bridge, we will become a richer society. Or if you put taxes on mobility and on moving stuff around, then we got a poor society that's simply not up for discussion. So, of course, storytelling is a huge part of the way politics work. But it's also part of how planning work. Copenhagen as a cycling city. In Copenhagen, we don't have cyclists. We merely have people transporting themselves by bike. That is also a very strong story. There is no nerdy cyclist in Copenhagen. It's just because it's the easiest way of doing it. So storytelling is always part of the way we do planning. It's also part of the way we do everyday life. And this is just to give another example of Odense, which is a city in Denmark, the third biggest city in Denmark. They had to do, they got this idea that they wanted to be totally climate neutral in 2030. They asked in an advisory board to come up with ideas on how to do that. Where do we save that energy? There were two elements of transportation, because there was a lot of quantitative model people in there. They wanted to have the zero emission zones. And I said, no, let's not put that out, because it's just going to mean that people are going to go berserk. Let's put the traffic plan promoting green and active mobility and some urban planning for livable cities out there. They did it anyways. I became, from 1 minute to the other, that there was a chairman of the whole board, and I became the second chairman, because nobody had the guts to talk to the politicians and the journalists about this transportation issue. So they needed somebody, also because I was the one who knew the most about it. And the thing is, I was totally right. Climate inequality initiatives cannot have social inequality where we make it possible for people in Odense who live in the suburbs to work in the city if they do not have an EV. It's the right-wing politicians that suddenly think inequality is really important in the way we plan cities. I would have to move to another place to keep my current mobility and let my friends visit me without demanding that they change so fast, or they haven't thought of city life at all. The city will for sure slowly die. And this is all about not being able to drive your car into the city. So it spurs these kind of engagement, or these kind of reactions. So I still have 10 minutes left, and I'm gonna make it. So this is why in the end here, I just want to say a little bit about a planning suggestion like the 15-minute city, for instance. A lot of us discussed it yesterday, so I'm gonna try to do this quickly without letting the rest of you who wasn't here into what it is. The idea has gained major attention since 2020 as part of a COVID-19 recovery strategy, climate change, and rising inequality. Of course, the COVID-19 meant something for this concept, because suddenly people were locked in to their houses or very short distances around their houses, and it became extremely clear that there is a huge difference in how close the important everyday functions are to people's lives. The idea is to create a greater functional integration locally in neighborhoods, in contrast to functionally segregated urban planning practices. The functionally segregated urban planning comes from the rational planning paradigm, where the whole idea is to have access by car. And when you have access by car, you actually don't need to be able to walk easily anywhere. And it does not bring the citizens to the functions, but the functions closer to the citizens. That's the whole idea. It has these 4 elements: proximity, diversity, density, ubiquity. Spatial and temporal proximity means that it has to be close to citizens' daily functions. And it's an optimum balance between the number of residents and the number of functions. That means when you talk about a dense area, you cannot have a not very dense area and think that everything should be available in that area, because that doesn't work. You also need to have the population to support the reason for that. Diversity in services, buildings, people, and culture, and the capacity that this can be fulfilled everywhere. And the whole thing with that capacity that it can be fulfilled everywhere is basically that this 15-minute city model is not a one-size-fit-all concept that you can just plug and play somewhere else. The whole idea is that it's a planning concept that you need to adjust to the local context so it actually fits. But what it does is it put up new agendas for how you actually create a well-functioning city. And in that sense, the 15 minutes is also just a framework. And it has this idea of chrono-urbanism that proposes a shift from measuring in distance to measuring in time. So instead of talking about that the kindergarten or the school is 1.5 or 2 kilometers away, it's 10 minutes away on bike or 5 minutes walking, because this is also how we measure time ourselves when we organize our everyday life. We don't measure it in kilometers, we measure it in how long it takes. So this is basically also part of how they think about it. And also because a school can be 1.5 kilometers away, but there can be a huge barrier like train tracks or a huge road in between, and that's very different. 10 minutes than if there's not, depending on which area you walk through. It's a planning principle focusing on understanding the different rhythms of the city that changes during the day, week, and season. Like a lot of this literature on non-spaces and empty spaces also comes from the way car infrastructure, for instance, works, is that a lot of the time it's empty, but when there is no cars, the space can't be used for anything else. So basically, the 15-minute city is also an idea of, for instance, using schoolyards when the schools are closed for something else, or thinking about how can we actually use all the space we have in the city in different ways around the year and also during the day. And it focuses on the experience time in everyday life. So basically, I just want to, I did a research project on it where we tried to look into the what kind of international examples are there, how had they been using it, and then we said, okay, what happens if we try to apply it to a Danish context? But what we want to do is we don't want to look at the functions, we want to look at how storytelling is actually supporting this concept. What was the role of storytelling in getting cities engaged in using the 15-minute city? And just to show you shortly, because I'm not getting into it, but you can find the report online, we have the 15-minute city international examples, the 15-minute city in a Danish context, and then the 15-minute city and in short. And this things is just to show you some of the things we did when we worked with how to create the right storytelling. The first thing we did was actually we made these isochrone cards. And what was interesting about that, the gray one is Ballerup, which is a suburb to Copenhagen. The two others are basically, no, that's all Odense. Oh, okay, but it's different places. You take an outside in the station and you basically figure out how far can you actually go on 15 minutes on foot and 15 minutes on bike. What was most interesting about this was it really surprised these municipalities. They really surprised them how many functions you could actually reach when you are biking or walking. We also basically showed, okay, where are the green areas, which kind of connections are there, what is missing. Then we looked into the political landscape, and we did these personas to understand what mattered to people, old people, young people, and families with kids. And basically, based on this, these 3 things, we went in and then we looked at what kind of storylines could you actually make for your city if you want to do a 15-minute city, because we just take an outside is what is already there. So it's basically a way of composing what is already there, the things that are already in the political plans, the things that the citizens want, which is not crazily surprising. And so that was actually quite interesting work, and also interesting to see how easy it actually was to make this connection between everyday life and policy and planning, because it was all there, but it was not necessarily told in the right way. The storytelling wasn't actually really in place. So there was a lot to do with the materials already there. So, but that was just to say that this was actually a quite interesting project. We are right now working on some articles on it, but it was an interesting project because the interaction between the everyday life and the policy and planning that is very often missing. It is not rocket science. It's not difficult to make. It's just something we don't do. So basically, to think about creating these stories also means to think about having a common project and having a common goal and having a common utopia. Because to have real power to inspire, mobilize, coordinate, and frame the activities of people across the city and beyond, attentions need to be given to the range of imaginative resources available within a city, from which to construct conceptions of the city and the specific processes through which it is richly and diversely imagined, or the city is articulated richly and diversely. People have great ideas. I always say, with all my years of doing empirical work, I never talked to anybody who couldn't see that it was problematic with the car, or who didn't really would like to do something else. It just didn't work if it function in their everyday life. I also never talked to anybody who didn't think the environment was important. Could be people have different priorities on it. But when it comes to getting everyday life organization to work, you do as you always did, the way you have routinized it and always practiced it. And this is also why, like, the 15-minute city or the way of telling stories is using these utopias. And it's also about taking emotion seriously, because what we have when we have numbers is that we cleaned it from emotions, because emotions is messy. It's a little bit annoying. What do we want to do with it? The problem is just that they're all over. They're all over people's everyday life. They're all over planning. They're all over politics, because this is what people carries with them. In culture lies emotions about one thing or another thing. And one of my favorite books from Andrew Sayer is called The Moral Significance of Class. And one of the things he says in that is that, ironically, one of the most fundamental flaws of neoclassical economies is the use of a model of the rational economic man who has no need for or no notion of fellow feeling, and hence is radically inept or autistic. And he continues in 2011 his book called Why Things Matter to People, also a good book. We are all ethical beings, not in the sense that we necessarily always behave ethically, but that as we grow up, we come to evaluate behavior according to some ideas of what is good and what is acceptable. So basically, it's his way of saying the role of emotions in everyday life and how we actually need to use them in creating different kind of stories about how our future should look, because this is how you can get people to do different things. And he basically also says this in his Moral Significance of Class book, that we only talk about the negative thing people have. We talk about negative values, but there's also the positive things like commitment, ethical dispositions and beliefs. It doesn't only need to prompt self-interest, but to varying degrees can include the welfare of others, hedonistic rather than egoistic. It's oriented to social well-being and happiness. So it's also a way of looking at how we actually put words and rationalizes or investigates negative things. Why is it that we don't put more emphasis on investigating some of the positive things? Because the storytelling about these positive things might get us a little bit further than, I'm not saying we shouldn't see all the inequalities and all the bad things. That's not what I'm trying to say, but maybe we could find a better way of balancing that. And in 2011, he also says, I have no truck with a romanticism that attempts to deflate reason or rationality. Rather, I argue that probably understood reason is involved in all these things. Emotions are part of creating reasons. Reasons are based on emotions. This is also an ontological discussion that I'm not going to go into because I have to finish. But of course, it is something about people thinking that there is such a thing called objective. Because if you ask me, of course, it doesn't exist. We always bring something with. If we're not aware what that is, it becomes even less objective. And the last thing I want to say is that one of these things that Monica Buscher and John Urry said in 2009 in this methods article is that the mobilities paradigm particularly through its immersive and at the same time analytical momentum, enables researchers to critically engage with the people and the matters they study in novel and highly effective ways, and to orient critically towards the future and not only the past. And I think that's a nice quote to end up with, because I think this is, as I already said in the beginning, a pretty important part of what our role are as in Denmark and Sweden state-paid academics who get money to actually think about how we can create a more sustainable world. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Malene. So then I think we can open up for some questions, both from people online and from you in the room. No questions? Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, thank you for this very interesting and discussion and the lecture. So my question is, I was just trying to understand to what extent in the Danish context does it become a default way of planning family life in the rural areas? Is there a trend of like shrinking cities and moving people outwards in the rural areas, which also kind of is associated with a good life and everything that comes with it? Or is
Actually up until COVID, and we still are expecting cities to grow because people didn't move away after they got kids, because before that it was very often people, they finished their education, they got kids, they moved to the suburb. But actually after COVID, people started moving out again. They are still expecting the cities to grow, but there are a trend towards people moving out of the city and getting homes in the suburbs or on the countryside. But one of the other things we also see in Copenhagen and is that people, when I made this concept of structural stories like 20 years ago, I think one of my key points with this idea that when you have kids, you need a car. And the reason why I actually found that interesting was because I was interviewing this couple my age who didn't have kids at home anymore. When I asked them why they had a car, they said, when you have kids, you need a car. And I thought, okay, that's interesting, but you don't have kids living at home anymore. So why is it that these kind of stories just get reproduced? And you could say the good thing is that this is not how it is in Copenhagen anymore, because young people say in Copenhagen, it doesn't make any sense to use a car to take your kids to kindergarten and to go to work, because it's much easier to use the bike. But we need a car when we have to visit our aunt who lives outside of the city. So they still have a car. So this created a new structural story for the car. So even if people are not moving to the suburbs, the getting a car is on the rise. More and more people buy cars. More and more people buy the second and the third car. And I think it's 95% of the time the average car is standing still 95% of the time, taking up space in Copenhagen. So now it's not only because they're moving out, it's simply because the whole idea of that's what you get from the car makes it, and also because of course there's a lot of issues in it. One of the projects I just did was about sharing. So we tried to take 3 areas in Copenhagen and figure out if we could do something about sharing solutions. It got a little bit ruined by the fact that Corona came, but it was still, we managed to do some things anyway. But one of the things that our final recommendations was actually is that you have this strong car system, and so many people have their own car. But then you want to have a new business model like shared cars. It's really difficult for shared cars to get seriously into the Danish market. But it's also because you have to get a new business idea that has a surplus from the beginning. So we're competing against a system that is financed to a high degree by the state, that's put in place for 100 years. And then you expect that people can make a business model that immediately can change that. And so there is huge inequality in that system. So it's not only because people move, but simply because people think they should have their own car. also if they live in the city and only use it once every third week. Yeah. And the more you have it, the more you use it. Yeah.
Thanks. Can I just follow up on that point? What do you think about, if we're talking about shared mobility and this, we're kind of asking large corporations to be able to provide shared mobility suddenly when they've been doing it individualized for so long. What about the role of the shared mobility services like the public transport authorities? I think this often with shared bikes or shared scooters. Why on earth are the local transport authorities not providing those? Because you instantly make train and bus services much more accessible when you can get there in 5 minutes instead of walking in 15. It seems crazy that they don't, and they could even extend to cars. It's just my thoughts. What do you think about that?
Yeah, but I totally agree. And I think actually at some point Germany actually used to be pretty good at it. They also had in the Deutsche Bahn also had cars. They don't anymore, but they are really good at car sharing services. But Deutsche Bahn has bikes. They don't have scooters. But I think definitely, and this is what we need an integrated mobility as a service system and public transport should be the backbone of that. And so in my mind, there's no doubt this is what we need for the future. We need planning that makes it more complicated for cars. That's not the same as we're not allowed to use cars. And this is finding a way we can actually have that discussion without that being the issue. Because, for instance, that we know in a Danish context, 30% of all trips are less than 3 kilometers. So we are doing a humongous number of trips. I think it's around 50% at less than 5. So we're doing so many trips that you could discuss if we need a car, and there would be people for whom it's complicated to get anywhere because of some handicap, but then we're going to solve that because we managed to solve so many things throughout humanity in the world. And so why is it that we're not able to create a system, makes it more complicated to use a car, and for those who really need it, we're going to find a way to solve that. Because in my mind, there's no doubt this is what we need. And I think what is happening, and this also happens all over the world, the more cars people buy, the more bad the service on public transport gets. So what is the hen and what is the egg is a long discussion, but there is no doubt that this is how it works. In Denmark, we just had to make it more expensive, take away some buses, because after Corona, people bought cars and they don't use the buses anymore. They complain they're not there, but when they're there, they don't use them. And I think, I mean, if we want to have a system where we just have e-cars that are replacing all the cars we have now, then we can just lean back and say, okay, that is solution. But if we don't want that, something really needs to be changed in the system, or this is how it's going to end. And I think it is seriously problematic with public transport. I also think it's seriously problematic that we have train systems that are not good enough, that people fly. In my university, people fly between Aalborg and Copenhagen. That's totally crazy. But it takes 5.5 hours by train because the 1 hour model they promised to make for I don't know how many years has now finally been cancelled. So it's also, there is a way of prioritizing that is absolutely off. And yeah, sustainable mobility needs a strong public transport system that has shared solution that is going to be able to cover, I think, a huge amount of people's needs for movement. So, and if you combine that with, it's basically what traffic islands or super blocks and all these ideas are basically about. It's about not making it the easiest thing to go 300 meters by car, but you have to go all the way around the neighborhood. And if you just want to go over there, take your bike on a walk because it's going to take you 4 minutes or something like that. But I think this is also what I try to say with everyday life is that people who don't use anything else by their car, they don't know that. They don't know the path system that takes you from here to here in 3 minutes. They only know the drive around by car, and they think if I have to walk, I have to go all the way around here and this people who don't use public transport, if a train gets delayed, everybody who's used to public transport, they pick up their phone, they do, okay, I do like this instead and get there, but they don't, they stand there and wait for half an hour, get really mad. So we shouldn't underestimate the competences of actually doing things in a different way than we normally do, because we don't have those competences, or most people don't.
Many thanks for the lecture. Which kind of policy or political changes do you think would be most important that would take into consideration these or this everyday life aspects that you have been researching? I mean, can range from very utopian to even a little bit more plausible, maybe.
I basically think there is something, if we could make policies about the transport hierarchy, I think that would be really, really interesting to say, I know it's not going to happen, but you're not allowed to plan cities where the car is on top of the hierarchy. The car always have to be in the bottom. That would make a huge change because it would change the way things are planned. It would change the way people are organizing their everyday life. It takes time and they need to get used to it, but we know that, for instance, one of the times where people seriously think about changing their mobility practices, for instance, is when they move house or change job or something, because they have to rethink these routines. So I think like creating policies that for so many years the car has been on top of the hierarchy in legislation and as well. So if that was redone, I know that's utopian, but that would change a lot of things because planning would follow, and the way schools and kindergartens organize themselves, the way workplaces organize themselves. Why is it that there is so much space for car parking in places like this? I mean, so if the university, if Linköping University had a responsibility to make it easy for people to commute by train and get here somehow in a different way, that it would be, I mean, think about all the space, these parking space, the land price of all that land. Yeah, exactly. So there's so much land that is laid out for parking here that I guess is for free, because I'm pretty sure people don't pay a lot to park here. Yeah, maybe they do. Okay, but there is a lot of things where when you suddenly started looking at all the elements of the prices of that and said, okay, we could use that money for something else. That would probably only happen if we had a legislation that said, put the car in the bottom of the hierarchy, it pollutes too much.
I can maybe ask a question as well. Making the connection to your answer to the previous questions about with competences, but also like who will make the changes. So, what's your take on the responsibility of the individual vis-a-vis the structure and the politicians, but also maybe in the planning as such? I mean, that is a common question, I guess, and a never-ending story and non-solvable, maybe. But it's been interesting to hear also.
Yep.
Based on that you started talking about givens and practices.
But I think this is also why I keep using this term individuals in relations, because I don't think any responsibility should be put on the individual. I think a lot of responsibility should also be put on individuals in relations to each other, like communities. But I think planning, and I think it's an interaction, but I would say where I would put in individual, but I would put specific responsibility on policy, specific responsibility on planning. I wouldn't put specific responsibility on individuals, but I would put specific responsibility on individuals in relations. Because I think this whole idea of thinking this is also what adfærd, beteende, is about, this thing that you can explain to people why they should do things differently, and they don't, because of course it's about so many other things. It's also a way too simplistic way of understanding people. And that we also know that when people are responding to something together with others, they feel much stronger and also much more willing to actually rethink how they can do things. But alone, it's it doesn't bring us anything, and we don't get anywhere with it. And it's not because of lack of will; it's just because it's too big a responsibility. And also, many people said to me, But why should I stop driving my car when everybody else is still doing it? And I can totally understand that. Why should I redo my everyday life organization and make everything complicated for me and my family because we have to rethink when my neighbor is still using his car to go buy bread Sunday morning? Yeah. So no responsibility on the individual.
So do we have, one more?
So we have this question from Annika Wappelhorst. She says, I would like to know what Malene thinks about the fact that we measure the 15-minute sitting in terms of 15 minutes for an average person, which is visually an able-bodied person. What about people who, for example, use a manual wheelchair and it may take longer than somebody who can cycle or walk? Is that included in the concept of how could it do?
It is, I mean, this is also why I kept saying this thing that the 15-minute city, it's just a framework. It's not a plug and play things. And there are, of course, people who don't have able bodies who cannot like fit into the same systems. But this is also where I said that this is where you need to find specific solutions. And again, I always say, look at the system we have today, because the system we have today is not very good for old people who are not that comfortable in traffic, or kids, for instance, who are not even allowed, most of them. So we have also a system today that is basically designed for some people and not very much designed for other types of people. And I think it's basically the same with able bodies, that we need to think about how can we make sure that there is space for those also to get around. But I also think that we also need to not make that stop us do things, because the 15-minute city means that we produce new inequalities or reproduce old one? Yeah, it can. Is there a problem with the 15-minute city that it can produce gentrification, because when new urban areas are being something is done with them, the land prices rise? Yeah, that's also a problem. But it's not the same as not doing anything, not going that way, because what we can see now is that the system we have now, that's not equal, and it's not for everybody. So what I'm more saying is the 15-minute city has a strong storytelling, it has a powerful storytelling, and not thinking about it as a plug and play concept. I think for many years planning has been very focused on this best cases. We go around the world, we find something, and then we implement it where we live ourselves. And I think in the 15-minute city, or at least my way of understanding it, and my whole argument also lies an idea that we need to stop this. Everything needs to be applied to the specific context. But there are elements that can be used, and there are elements of thinking in time and how long it takes. But is it more fair to think in the time it takes for somebody in a wheelchair than somebody who can walk? I don't know, but we at least need to think about that we need to start somewhere, and then we need to find a solution, because of course we can find them. It's a question of will. We can do so many other things. We send people to the moon, and we have high speed this and that, and they make automated cars. We can find a way to create a system that it's also for not as able people.
So, all right, do we have any more questions, comments? No. All right, but then I think that we again can thank Malene, and then we can all here in the room continue into Brage and continue talking about these very important subjects there, I think. So thank you so much. Yeah.